Hey everybody, welcome to Board Online, Board Offline. Today we have the second part, which is the final part of our How to Play Pax Emancipation. Now we are teaching the advanced rule set here, so you're going to get the entire idea of how to play this game. If you haven't seen the first part, be sure to go check that out. That basically covers the setup. This is going to cover all of the gameplay. Also, be sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Co. This is a website where you can buy games from them. They have a great stock of games with some great prices. You can sell games to them, and you can trade games over there as well. They have a whole system that they've worked out. They can link into your Board Game Geek account to see what games you have that they'd be interested in trading. And you know what games, they'll give you a list obviously on their site of which ones they're trading out, and there's values for the games that are right there on the site that you can kind of match up and say as far as what they are willing to trade. I think the trade feature over there is really a pretty cool idea. So be sure to go check them out. There's a link in the description below so they know that I sent you over there. So be sure to click that if you go over there. And that's Board Game Co., which is a great place to buy, sell, and trade your way into a better collection. All right, let's get right down the table, and I'm going to finish teaching you how to play Pax Emancipation. Each round of play always consists of the same player turn sequence. Parliament, followed by the philanthropists, followed by the evangelicals. Each player's turn consists of 5 phases: the action phase, the ops phase, the elephant phase, the hate and pogrom roll phase, and the revolution phase. The player's turn is then wrapped up by refreshing the market. Before we discuss each of the phases of a turn in detail, I want to discuss a few terms and ideas that will be key in understanding the phases. Any action or op that is referred to in the rulebook as costly means that it will require some amount of gold to perform. For instance, shipbuilding costs 3 gold and is therefore a costly action. Gold is generated by moving an agent from capital to wealth or from wealth to debt. This may be done in any order and may be done multiple times to generate the necessary gold. However, generated gold may never be kept from turn to turn, and a player may only ever generate the amount of gold required to complete the action or op in question. Some actions and ops require the player to install their financial agents onto market cards as syndication or revolutionaries, or onto the map as admin or marines. If the op or action in question is costly, the player must first generate the necessary gold, as we previously discussed, and then install the agent. If playing as either Parliament or Evangelicals, the player must install the agent from the top of their board, like this. Or if there is no agent at the very top, the topmost position. A player could even use an agent from debt if all of the agents were in debt. However, the philanthropists ignore this rule as their special ability and may install agents from anywhere on the financial board. An agent returned to the player's finance board for any reason is placed in the wealth box. The game refers to this as divesting the agent. There are many reasons an agent may be returned to the wealth box during the course of the game, such as when the player divests, if the player's admin suffers a coup or hate kill, if the agent is involved in a successful revolution, or if the player privatizes a nationalized agent belonging to her. We'll discuss each of these situations in detail throughout this video. Corruption returns 1 barrier from a player's victory pile to the appropriate sphere. The chosen victory pile may be any player's that contains the appropriate barrier. The game refers to this as the barrier being regressed. Corruption can occur from piracy rolls, which we'll discuss during the Maritime Op portion of this video, and corruption may also occur from a law being passed as a result of a successful revolution, which we'll discuss during the revolution portion of this video. Okay, now let's discuss the 5 phases of a turn in detail, starting with the actions phase. A player may choose up to 2 actions to perform. The available actions are Fundraiser, Syndicate, Shipbuilding, Post, Legislate, and join revolution. The player may play their 2 actions in any order, and they may choose to play the same action twice. The Fundraiser Action is a 3-step process which improves the player's capital on her finance board. First, the player may freely return any number of agents of their color in play to the wealth box. These could be from syndication, revolutions, marines, or admin. This is called divesting. Second, if the player has agents in both debt and capital, the player spends 1 capital agent into wealth for each debt agent raised out of debt. The player does this until they have no agents in either capital or debt. As you can see in this case, capital ran out first. Finally, the player moves all agents in the wealth box to the capital box. The red player also has a 4th bonus step. If the red player didn't divest any Marines, then that player can immediately perform a free Maritime Op. We'll discuss Maritime Ops shortly. Now would be a good time to mention that during this video, you may see components next to each other or in orientations to each other that you might not normally see during the game. For instance, it's unlikely in your setup that the player's finance board would be right next to the market like this. However, for ease of recording and for demonstration purposes, I'll be setting up these components in ways that may not be conventionally the way they're set up. Nothing I do will affect gameplay, however. The next action is the Syndicate Action. This action is costly. A player who chooses the Syndicate Action will take one of her uppermost agents from the finance board and install it on an idea. This agent will then allow the player to choose one of the card's listed ops to perform each turn during the op phase. Having an idea syndicated is also a necessary first step towards legislating that card. The base cost to syndicate depends on the idea's location in the market by row, from bottom to top. The bottommost idea is 0 gold, while the next is 1, and then 2, and then so on, with the top card being the most expensive at 5 gold. The card on top of the draw deck may not be syndicated. In addition to the base cost, if another agent is already on the idea to be syndicated, then the player must pay a cost equal to the number of additional agents squared. This even includes any agents already there that belong to the current player. So if 1 agent were on a card, it would cost 1 additional gold. If 2 agents were there, it would be 4 gold. So let's say the red player wants to syndicate this card. Based on this card's position in the market, it costs 1 gold to syndicate. There's no other agents on the card, so 1 gold is the cost to syndicate this card. The player would pay 1 gold by moving 1 agent from capital to wealth, and then take an agent from the uppermost box and place it on this card. The Shipbuilding Action costs 3 gold, so 1, 2, 3 for instance, and places 1 new ship token on any sea border that does not already have a ship token. Additionally, this action adds 1 financial agent from the player's pool to their debt. The red player may also optionally install a marine on any ship that does not already have one, whether it's the one that was just built or one that already exists. After doing so, the red player may then perform Gunboat Diplomacy. We'll discuss Gunboat Diplomacy shortly. Shipbuilding immediately sets up an underground railroad between 2 spheres whenever one of them contains the elephant. The underground railroad means that if one sphere doesn't have a white barrier and the other one does, it is considered to also not have one. The same goes for red barriers. It's also important to note that once the Industrial Revolution factory is built, ships for that player now only cost 2 gold to build instead of 3. Next, let's discuss the Post Action. This action is both costly and is an elephant action. Remember, elephant actions are always notated on the finance board with an elephant symbol. This action adds an admin to the elephant's sphere's admin spot from the player's finance board. For player green and red, the cost of the post action is the barrier cost. In other words, the players must spend an amount of gold equal to the number of barriers for that sphere, in this case, 2. However, it should be noted that the special ability of the evangelicals is that the post action is free. Once the cost is paid, The player takes an admin from the uppermost box and places it in an admin spot in the elephant's sphere. If the chosen spot happens to be occupied by an admin already, whether belonging to the current player or another player, that admin will suffer martyrdom. Anytime an admin is removed involuntarily from the map, whether through the post action or a hate kill, it is said to have been martyred. This generates one dissident of the martyr's color, which is placed in one of the dissident squares of that sphere. If the dissident squares are already full, the current player instead places one anarchy on the sphere. The Legislate Action triggers the impacts of the idea being legislated, returns all syndicated agents, and then inserts the idea into a splay where the idea is viable. In order to legislate an idea, certain preconditions must be met. The player must have an agent on the idea, and the idea must be viable in the chosen splay. To be viable, there must be a freedom pair in one of the splays, as you see here, comet and candle, that matches the two freedom ideas on the card, comet and candle. Before putting the idea in the splay, the impacts on the left of the card resolve from top to bottom. We'll cover impacts in detail shortly. Any agents on the card are put back into the wealth box of their owner, and the player then places the idea into the splay with one of the two freedom icons showing at the bottom. This idea has now created another freedom pair, in this case, feather comet. This means that this splay now has the ability to allow legislation of any idea that has comet candle or candle feather or feather comet. If a sixth idea is ever legislated to the general will, the first idea must be discarded. Before moving on to the next action, let's discuss each of the 6 possible impacts players will find when legislating ideas. Impacts are optional bonus ops that only occur through legislation. Anytime an available impact can't be performed, simply ignore it. The possible impacts are syndication, post, wealth, revolutionary, shipbuilding, and claim barrier. The syndication impact allows the player to move an agent from the pool to any idea, even if that idea is already syndicated, without needing to pay any gold. The post impact allows the player to obtain a new admin agent from the pool, and they must then place it in the admin spot of the port specified, even if the sphere is diseased or modern. In this case, Istanbul. This will not move the elephant. If the sphere is diseased, then the player claims the diseased disc into their victory pile. This can be done even if the player does not have the Industrial Revolution. And as usual, if there was an agent already there, it suffers martyrdom. Wealth allows the player to take a new agent from the pool and place it into the wealth box. Revolutionary allows the player to take an agent from the pool and place it on an ongoing revolution. This even works if the revolution is already full. Alternatively, the player may launch a revolution bypassing all prerequisites and then add one revolutionary to it. This could be a diseased sphere and could even result in an instant revolutionary victory outside the normal revolution phase. We'll discuss everything about revolutions shortly. The shipbuilding impact allows the player to obtain a new ship token and place it in any sea border that doesn't already have one. This does not cost any gold. If there happen to already be red agents on the map, the player may move onto the ship and perform Gunboat Diplomacy. And finally, claim a white barrier, a red barrier, or a red or white barrier, which happens to be an elephant impact. This allows the player to claim a barrier of the specified color. As usual, the player must move the elephant to the chosen sphere, or if the elephant is already moved, the impact must be taken in the sphere the elephant is already in. Depending on which of these impacts is used, the player simply claims a barrier of the appropriate color into their victory pile. Now that we've finished talking about impacts and the Legislate Action, let's discuss the Join Revolution Action, which is a costly action. This action takes an agent from the finance board and installs it onto a revolution. This agent is then known as a revolutionary. Each revolution has 1 to 4 engagement spots, in this case 2 spots, and the cost to join the revolution is equal to the number of agents already on the revolution squared. So in this case, the cost is 0. However, in this case, the cost is 1. The player pays the cost and then takes an agent and places it on the revolution. The agent must always be placed on the leftmost open spot. However, it is possible to join a revolution whose spots are full by continuing to place agents in a row. When joining a revolution, the player has the option to flip the card to its other side, causing a counter-revolution. The cost to create this counter-revolution is equal to the number of dissidents belonging to another player squared. Here, there are 2 dissidents in the European sphere, so it'll cost 4 gold. Do a counter-revolution. 1, 2, 3, 4. When causing a counter-revolution, the player must keep the revolutionaries in the order they were already in. And that covers all of the actions available to the player. After the player has completed 2 actions, she moves into the ops phase, seen here. In the ops phase, the player may perform as many ops as they have syndicated or revolutionary agents. Each agent may be used for only one of the ops listed on the card. Once the op has been performed, the player will cover it with an agent to indicate that it has been expended, as has the agent. Ops may be performed in any order. The possible ops available to the player are Maritime, Manumission, Westernize, Suffrage, Literacy, Lawsuit, and Plebiscite. The Maritime Op activates any number of Marines which may either move from one ship to another or from one ship back to that very same ship. The player may then perform Gunboat Diplomacy in each destination. Alternatively, the red player may use this op to install a Marine to an existing ship. The red player may then perform Gunboat Diplomacy on that ship. We've mentioned Gunboat Diplomacy several times up to this point, so this is probably a good time to discuss it in detail. Anytime a Marine is installed or moved onto a ship token, the player may immediately perform Gunboat Diplomacy. The player has 3 options each time Gunboat Diplomacy is performed and must choose one. The first option is to claim anarchy from an adjacent sphere. That anarchy token is then placed in the player's victory pile. The second option is to claim an embargo, which are the purple barriers, from one of the 2 adjacent spheres. As usual, that would go into the player's victory pile. The third option is to engage in a piracy roll. To resolve a piracy roll, the player must do the following in order. First, the player chooses a number of dice to roll from 1 to 4. In this case, let's say the player chose 2 dice. The player then pays gold equal to the number of dice squared, so 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The player then rolls the dice and adds the result. If the number rolled, in this case 8, is greater than the number of slaves combined in the 2 spheres adjacent to that ship, the player claims the slaver. There are 1, 2, 3 open slave squares in the 2 spheres adjacent, so the player has in fact defeated the slaver. If, on the other hand, the player fails to roll a number greater than the number of slaves, then the piracy roll fails and nothing happens. If the player chooses to roll just a single die, there is a chance for corruption. If the die face matches one of the dice shown on the slaver ship, corruption occurs. This happens even if the player has successfully sunk the slaver. As usual, corruption will cause one barrier to be returned to one of the 2 adjacent spheres. The player may take the barrier from any victory pile. If both spheres already have all their barriers, then instead anarchy would be placed in one of the spheres. The Manumission Op is both costly and an elephant op. It liberates a slave by placing a meeple of the player's color from the pool. The cost to do this is equal to the number of barriers remaining in the sphere, so in this case, it costs 1. If there were no slaves to liberate in the elephant's port, the manumission would not be possible. The Westernize Op is an elephant op. It liberates a slave by placing a meeple of the player's color from the pool. In order to perform a Westernize Op, there must either be an admin of the player's color in the elephant's port, or there must be no red barriers. Remember, the player may use the Underground Railroad to achieve the no red barrier condition. The Suffrage Op is both costly and an elephant op. This allows the player to claim one barrier, choosing from any of the chits in the elephant sphere, and alternatively it can regress one barrier, returning it to the elephant sphere. Prior to resolving suffrage, the player must either have the majority in the elephant's port, meaning that their color outnumbers the number of slaves plus other players, or there are no white barriers, which can be achieved with the Underground Railroad. The cost of suffrage is equal to the number of slavers adjacent to the sphere squared, so in this case, 1. The Literacy Op places one dissident of the player's color in the elephant sphere taken from the pool. As usual, if the dissident squares are full, Anarchy will be placed on the board instead. The admin at the elephant's port must be the same as the player color performing this op. The Lawsuit Op allows the player to place one idea from the market into the Bill of Rights display. This is the only way an idea can get into the Bill of Rights without being viable, which means the first idea to be placed into the display must be placed with a lawsuit. The chosen idea must be located beneath the Lawsuit Op in the same column, so in this case, this would be the only possibility. A lawsuit costs the amount of gold equal to the current number of agents on the chosen idea squared. So in this case, it would cost 0 gold. And in this case, it would cost 4 gold. As usual, all agents on the chosen idea are placed into their wealth box. And as we've previously mentioned, when the idea is moved into display, the player chooses one freedom to be visible, while the other one is tucked underneath. This, of course, creates a freedom pair, which will allow legislation to possibly move ideas into the Bill of Rights in the future. No impacts are ever resolved as a result of a lawsuit. After a lawsuit, the player may perform a bonus petition, which we'll discuss in just a moment. The Plebiscite Op is identical to the Lawsuit Op, except that it places an idea into the general will instead of the Bill of Rights. Everything else is done in exactly the same way. Remember that if a 6th card is ever placed into the Bill of Rights, then the first idea in display is discarded. Immediately following either a lawsuit or plebiscite op, the player may use a bonus petition. There are 3 possible bonus petitions, and the one the player may use is based on the freedom icon the player chose to make visible. If the icon the player is going to choose is red, then the player may nationalize a white or green agent on the chosen idea. This means the player will move that agent to their wealth box. The other one will go back to its owner's wealth box. Nationalized agents may never be installed on other parts of the game and must remain on the player's finance board. If the nationalized agent is ever moved to the red player's debt box, then it is immediately moved to its original wealth box. Alternatively, if the icon is red and the current player is white or green, then that player may privatize a nationalized agent back to their wealth box. If the icon is black, on the other hand, the player may immediately perform one legislate on an idea. The chosen idea must have one of the player's agents on it, and it must be viable as usual. Once this is done, the player will then take a random card from an unused pile and use it to fill the gap which was just formed in the market. This prevents a premature ending to the game. And finally, whether the icon is red or black, either one, the player may always choose the bailout bonus petition. To do this, the player simply performs the Fundraiser Action as normal. Once the player has completed the ops phase, next is the elephant phase. First in this phase, the player rolls 1d6. If the player has taken no elephant actions, ops, or impacts during their turn, they must move the elephant the number of spheres indicated clockwise around the board. However, if they have taken an elephant action, op, or impact, the elephant will not move and will stay right where it is. In this case, let's say no elephant action, op, or impact has been taken, so it's going to move 5 spheres. When walking clockwise around the board, the elephant will skip all modern spheres and diseased spheres. It skips the diseased spheres even if the player has the factory token on the board. So in this case, the elephant would move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Once the elephant is at its destination sphere, point it to the port with the most freedmen plus admin. In this case, Virginia. If there are tied ports, then the player will choose. Next, if the market has no gaps in it, as you see here, then one market card is discarded. The idea card selected is based on the number previously rolled, counting up from the bottom of the Western market. So in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, this idea will be discarded. If that idea card had any agents on it, they would be placed back in their owner's wealth box. If the selected card has this east to west cultural diffusion arrow, then the card is pushed to the adjacent east position and the eastern card is discarded. If any agents happen to be on this card when it diffused from west to east, those agents would be carried with it. If a revolution is discarded, such as by this card diffusing to the east, causing it to be discarded, any agents on that revolution will be discarded into the pool rather than going back into the wealth box. Once the elephant phase is resolved, the players enter the hate and Pogrom Roll phase. This roll occurs in the elephant's current port. First, the hate roll occurs. The number of dice involved in the hate roll is equal to the number of uncovered spaces in the elephant's port up to a maximum of 4. Uncovered spaces can include the admin, any slave spaces, and the port. So in this case, 4 spaces would be uncovered, and so 4 dice would be rolled. However, in this case, only 2 spaces are uncovered, a slave and the port, so 2 dice will be rolled. In this way, the port will always be uncovered, which means that the player will always have to roll at least 1 die for the hate roll. The player rolls the dice and compares the die faces to the barriers for that sphere. The dice shown on the barriers are known as bloody dice. If a die face matches 1 or more of the bloody dice, the player will suffer the associated loss. In this case, we got lucky and the 2 4s don't match anything on the bloody dice. But let's say that instead, a 6 and a 5 had been rolled. The 6 matches both of these dice, and the 5 matches this one. Red, white, and green bloody dice result in the death of a freedman or agent of the associated color in the elephant's port. If both an admin and a freedman are available to be killed, the player chooses. In this case, the dice are trying to kill a white token and a green token. Let's say that this one was a 1, and so now we're trying to kill a red token. If a freedman is killed, the player moves the meeple to a dissident box just like this. If all the dissident squares are full, then as we've mentioned before, the player instead will place 1 anarchy into the sphere. But let's say the dissident squares are full and the sphere has 2 anarchy, which is the maximum anarchy any sphere can hold. What happens now? In this case, anarchy will spread to any adjacent sphere. If an admin is martyred instead, then 1 dissident is still placed in the dissident box. And that admin is placed in the wealth box of its owner. If a yellow bloody die is rolled, then the player must spend 1 gold. If the player happens to already be completely in debt, then the player just ignores this penalty. If a purple bloody die is rolled, then a merchantman ship is sunk. That merchantman ship must be adjacent, and keep in mind that merchantmen are player ships that do not have a marine on them. So if a marine is there, the ship is protected. Some bloody dice have this jagged black collar around them. This represents frustrated and hateful mobs. If the player's hate roll matches one of these bloody dice, but none of the associated color is in the elephant's port, the player must instead place 1 anarchy on the sphere. So as you can see, there's no white tokens here, and since the black jagged collar is around that bloody die, an anarchy gets played in the 13 colonies. As usual, if there's already 2 anarchy in the sphere and a 3rd needs to be placed, it instead spills over to an adjacent sphere. The one exception to this is if the hate roll occurs in a sphere that started this phase with 5 barriers, as you see here. This sphere is currently ruled by a tyranny. Hate rolls and pogrom rolls still occur in a tyranny, but frustrated mobs do not. So this 4 with the black collar around it would not cause anarchy. In a solitaire or fully co-op game, ignore the rule about tyrannies. Frustrated mobs will occur in those games, even in a sphere with 5 barriers. After the hate roll comes the Pogrom Roll. For each sphere with 2 anarchy, roll 1d6. If a 1, 2, or 3 is rolled, remove a white, red, or green token respectively from the sphere to the pool. In this case, red. This does not create a dissident. If the sphere has no tokens of the indicated color, then nothing happens. If instead a 4, 5, or 6 is rolled, then the player must place 1 anarchy on the board. Since the sphere already has 2 anarchies, it will spread to an adjacent sphere. It's possible that this will then create the condition for another Pogrom Roll. If that's the case, roll there as well. Anytime a sphere has accumulated both dissidence and anarchy, a revolution will launch into the market during the revolution phase. Once the revolution is in the market, it will then move along inside the market just like any other idea. It's also possible that several revolutions will be launched on the same turn, and the active player will decide which order they are launched in. A revolution in the eastern sphere will always be launched into the eastern column, and a revolution in the western sphere, as you see here, will always be launched into the western column. The revolution will replace the idea with the lowest number for its firebrand. So let's say this 68 is the lowest firebrand. This idea is discarded. If there are more red dissidents, then the red side of the revolution will be chosen. And if there are more white dissidents, then the white side will be chosen. If the number of red and white dissidents is tied, as you see here, tied at 0, then the active player chooses which side to place face up. If the revolution sphere has all dissident squares filled and all of them are the same color, take 1 pawn from the pool of that color and add it to the revolution as a revolutionary. Also, if any pawns were on the idea that gets replaced, they become revolutionaries as well. The active player gets to choose the order in which they are placed. When a player performs a legislation, lawsuit, or plebiscite that makes a previously non-viable revolution now viable, that player must add a revolutionary agent from the pool for free. This agent must be added to the current side of the revolution and may be added even if all revolutionary spots are already full. It's also possible for multiple revolutions to become viable at the same time in this way, in which case the player would add revolutionaries to each of them. A revolution fails instantly if it is removed from the market for any reason, even if it's viable and has all revolutionary spots filled. The revolution is returned to the public deck. All revolutionaries that were on the card, as well as the sphere's admin and the sphere's dissidents, are all returned to the pool. All barriers are returned to the sphere. The only thing that will remain in the sphere are any freedmen and anarchy. Failing a revolution is a huge setback for the players. However, if a revolution is both viable and has all of its revolutionary spots full during the revolution phase, it succeeds. This will cause the sphere to be modernized, the player or players involved in the revolution will pass laws, and the revolutionaries will be returned to their wealth box if not posted when passing laws. Keep in mind, it is possible that a revolution will find itself to be immediately viable and have all engagement spots filled as soon as it's launched. If that's the case, it is instantly successful. So let's talk about modernization first. To modernize the sphere, flip it to the modern side. Freedmen and admin are kept in their original spots. However, dissidents are moved to empty slave spots of the player's choice. If there was not enough room for the dissidents, instead they would immigrate to the non-disease sphere with the fewest number of barriers, having at least 1 empty slave space. In the case of a tie, the player would choose. If the elephant had happened to be here when this sphere modernized, it would walk 1 sphere clockwise as normal. After modernization, the players now are able to pass laws. Each player with a revolutionary performs 1 law per revolutionary, beginning with the most recently placed and working backward. There are 8 possible laws, and the first 6 may be chosen multiple times. Law 1 is to claim one barrier from the revolutionary sphere. Law 2 is to claim one anarchy from the revolutionary sphere. Law 3 is to claim one slaver adjacent to the revolutionary sphere. Law 4 is to return one barrier from any victory pile to the revolutionary sphere. Law 5 is to post one of the revolutionaries as an admin in an unfilled agency in any sphere other than a modern one. Also, the admin may not be placed in a diseased sphere unless the player has a factory. Law 6 is to place one meeple of any color into an empty slave spot in the revolutionary sphere. Law 7 is to build the player's factory cube, placing it on the map in the revolutionary sphere. Once built, it can only be removed through Pogrom Rolls. The factory now allows the player to build ships for 2 gold and also to enter disease spheres, claiming the disease token. In Law 8, the player may place the revolution into a splay in which it is viable. When doing this, the revolution may not be flipped to the opposite side. If placed on the Bill of Rights, the revolution discards all previous ideas, with the exception of previously placed revolutions. If this law isn't chosen, then simply discard the revolution at the end of the turn. Neither the elephant nor dissidents can be placed in a modern sphere. If no agent is posted in an admin spot, then the default admin color is shown, so in this case green and red, and that is referenced on the other side with the circle around the admin spot. The last thing a player does on their turn is restore the market to a full 6x2 matrix of cards. First, slide all cards down to fill in any gaps. Then, draw cards from the decks at the top of the columns to complete the columns. If one deck runs out, most frequently it'll be the Western deck, then start drawing from the other deck to fill in that column. If there are gaps in both the East and the West column, always fill the East column first. Any agents that are sitting on an Ops icon are moved elsewhere onto the card. If during this step, the market cannot be refilled because both decks at the top of the columns are empty, the cooperative era ends, and at this point all players will check to see if they avoided their personal counter-enlightenment. Each player who suffers their counter-enlightenment will not score any victory points. Red's counter-enlightenment occurs if the game ends with more slavers than red agents on the board, including admins and marines. Here the red player has 1, 2, 3, 4 agents on the board, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 slavers, which means the red player has suffered their counter-enlightenment. White's counter-enlightenment occurs if the game ends with fewer than 15 freedmen. Here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 freedmen, which clearly is fewer than 15, so white has suffered their counter-enlightenment. Green's counter-enlightenment occurs if the game ends with greater than 25 barriers on the board. Here there are 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 barriers, so green has successfully avoided their counter-enlightenment and will score victory points. If one or more players suffer the counter-enlightenment, then the game ends immediately and scoring proceeds with the players who did not suffer counter-enlightenment. Also, if at the beginning of the game the players chose to play cooperative or solo mode, then the game ends at this point regardless. The players who are able to score victory points count each chit or disc in their victory pile. Each thing in the victory pile counts for 1 victory point with the exception of the disease disc, which counts 3 victory points. Each token of a player's color on the map counts for 1 victory point with the exception of dissidents, and dissidents always count as 1 victory point for the white player regardless of the color. Everyone adds up all their victory points together, and the combined score of 50 to 74 is considered a marginal victory, while a score of 75 or more is considered a decisive victory. In the event that all players avoid their counter-enlightenment, the game will continue into the competitive era, assuming that players chose to play this way. At the end of this era, there will be a single player with the most victory points, and that player will be declared the winner. To start the competitive era, shuffle all the West ideas that were discarded in the cooperative era with the previously unused cards, and then deal out a 7-card deck for a 3-player game and a 5-card deck for a 2-player game, and place it face up just as before, and then do the same with the East ideas. Play then continues where the players left off. The competitive era ends in the exact same way as the cooperative era, when a market cannot be refreshed because there's an empty space and there's no deck to refresh it with. Final scoring is similar to the final scoring previously described, but with a few changes. Let's quickly run through the entire scoring process, including these changes. Each chitter disc in a victory pile is worth 1 victory point, with the exception of the disease disc, which is worth 3 victory points. Each token of a player's color on the map counts as 1 victory point, with the exception of the factory and dissidents. Dissidents always count as 1 victory point for the white player. The factory counts a number of points equal to the number of ships adjacent to that sphere squared. The red player then gains 1 victory point for every token other than dissidents in a democracy. A democracy is a sphere with at least 1 red barrier and no white barriers. However, the white player gains 1 victory point for every token in a theocratic monarchy, which is a sphere with at least 1 white barrier and no red barriers. Dissidents do not count towards this scoring for the white player. And the green player gains 1 victory point for every token not including dissidents in a republic, which is a sphere with no barriers at all. And finally, revolutions in display with visible victory points, as you can see here, count for the indicated player. So in this case, 3 victory points for the red player. Whereas if it was like this, it would be 2 victory points for the green player. Besides the game running its natural course, there are 2 additional ways that the game can end regardless of the mode the player is playing. If all the anarchy ends up on the map at the end of the market refresh phase, the world descends into a dark age and the game ends in failure. Alternatively, the game will end and victory points will be counted if every single sphere is modernized. There you go, that's everything you need to know to play Pax Emancipation. This was a beast to put together, but I have really enjoyed the process, really enjoyed doing this, and I hope it's been helpful for all of you and that you get into this game, because it really is a game with such a steep learning curve that I'm afraid a lot of people aren't going to play it and that would otherwise enjoy it. But once you get past that learning curve, once you get into it and figure it out, if you saw my recent top 9 best solo games, this is my number 3 on that list now. It's a game that I wasn't sure I was going to love, wasn't sure I was even going to like once I started kind of getting into the rules. And it has been a very rewarding experience learning how to play this game. If you have any other questions, be sure to leave that in the comments section below. You can find me on Twitter @BoardOffline. And until next time, if you're bored online, board offline.